The storm hit Sun Bay before midnight and didn't leave until dawn. By the time Caleb Moore reached the beach that morning, the tide had already pulled back, leaving behind tangled ropes, broken crates, and the salt-heavy silence that always followed a bad storm. He wasn't looking for anything unusual, he was looking for his nets. He found her instead. She was lying near the rock ridge at the far end of the cove, face down in the wet sand, one arm stretched toward the waterline as if she'd tried to crawl the rest of the way in. A waterproof bag was clutched to her chest. Around her neck hung a small silver shell pendant, catching the early morning light like something that refused to be lost. Caleb didn't think. He ran. She was alive, barely. He carried her to the watchman's shed near the dock, the only shelter close enough. When she finally opened her eyes, he had nothing to offer her but a piece of grilled fish, still warm from the morning fire. He held it out and said awkwardly, "Do you eat fish?" She laughed, then stopped cold when she saw the lighthouse through the window. "I've been looking for this place," she whispered, "for 15 years. If you're new here, stories like this one come out every week. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now let's find out what she was really carrying. Caleb Moore was not the kind of man people wrote stories about. He was 36, broad-shouldered, with hands that had been rough since his 20s from salt water and rope friction. He lived in a small house at the edge of Sun Bay's fishing quarter with his 8-year-old son Eli, a leaky roof he kept meaning to fix, and a wooden boat that had seen better decades. Every morning he was on the water before sunrise. Every afternoon he sold whatever he caught at the dockside market. Every evening he and Eli sat on the beach, mending nets by firelight, grilling fish that Eli claimed tasted like punishment. "Dad," Eli had said once, staring at a blackened piece of mackerel, "I think you cooked it twice." Caleb had laughed at that. He laughed easily around Eli, more easily than anywhere else. He wasn't a complicated man. He believed in showing up, in keeping his word, in staying out of other people's business. After his wife Dana died 3 years ago, he had chosen to stay in Sun Bay rather than move inland the way some people suggested. The ocean was loud enough to fill the quiet she left behind. That was the most honest reason he had, and he never said it out loud to anyone. Eli was the one who kept the house from feeling empty. The boy was sharp, quick-mouthed, and had an unsettling habit of being right about things. He wore a cord bracelet on his wrist, the cord from Dana's silver shell pendant, a keepsake Caleb had kept after the funeral. The shell itself sat on the shelf above Caleb's bunk, small and carefully made, the kind of thing worn every day rather than saved for occasions. Dana used to say that a shell holds the sound of the sea inside it, even when you carry it far from the water. Eli took that literally and pressed it to his ear at least once a week to check. Sun Bay itself looked from a distance like a postcard. Colorful boat hulls lined the dock. The morning fish market filled the air with noise and salt and the particular kind of laughter that only happens between people who have known each other too long. Children ran barefoot across the sand. Old men repaired nets in the shade of coconut palms and argued about weather they couldn't control. But something had been shifting in Sun Bay for the past 2 years, quietly the way rot moves through wood before anyone notices the surface. A development company had set its sights on the beach. The plan was a high-end resort, private shoreline luxury cabins, a marina for yachts instead of fishing boats. Several families had already been pressured into selling their land. The traditional fish market was at risk. The dock, where Caleb had sold his catch every afternoon for 11 years, was listed in the development blueprints as a future amenity zone, which meant it would be gone. The man behind it all was Victor Harlan. Most people in Sun Bay knew Victor the way you know someone who grew up beside you and then became something you didn't expect. He was 52 now, silver-haired, always in clean clothes that looked slightly too formal for a beach town. But he had been born here. His father had repaired engines at the old dock. Victor had run barefoot on the same sand as everyone else, had eaten fish from the same fires, had spent summers hauling nets before he was old enough to understand what hauling nets was doing to his back. He had left Sun Bay at 20, gone to the city, built money out of money the way certain people learn to do, and come back 20 years later not as a neighbor, but as an investor. Most people still called him Victor. Some of the older fishermen still slapped him on the back like he was one of them. Caleb had been one of those people. He had respected Victor, admired him, even as proof that a man from Sun Bay could make something of himself without losing where he came from. That feeling had been fading for 2 years. It was nearly gone now. Caleb didn't want to get involved in the fight over the beach. He had Eli to think about. He had Dana's old boat to keep running. He had enough trouble without borrowing more. So he kept his head down, sold his fish, mended his nets, and told himself that staying out of it was a reasonable choice. He believed that right up until the morning after the storm. The watchman's shed smelled like old rope and machine oil. It was barely large enough for a cot, a rusted folding chair, and a small iron grate where Caleb had already started a fire to dry his clothes. He laid the woman down on the cot and stepped back, uncertain what to do next. She was breathing. That was the first thing. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and the color was already coming back to her face by the time he'd gotten her through the door. Her clothes were soaked through, practical outdoors gear, not the kind tourists wore. The waterproof bag she'd been clutching was still in her arms. She hadn't let go of it even while unconscious, which told him something, though he wasn't sure what. The silver shell pendant around her neck caught his eye. Small, carefully made, the kind of thing worn every day. It was different from Dana's, but something in the shape of it made him look twice. He didn't touch it. He pulled the spare blanket from the shelf above the grate, draped it over her, and sat down on the folding chair to wait. He had been there about 10 minutes when she opened her eyes. She looked at the ceiling first, then at the walls, then at him, and her body went rigid the way a person goes rigid when they wake up somewhere unfamiliar and the brain hasn't caught up yet. "You're okay," Caleb said. "You were on the beach. I brought you in." She stared at him for a moment. Then she sat up slowly, wincing, and pressed one hand to the side of her head. "The bag," she said. "Right there." He nodded toward it. "You never let go of it." She pulled it closer without opening it and exhaled. Some of the tension went out of her shoulders. Caleb reached toward the grate where he'd set the remains of his breakfast on a flat stone to keep warm. 2 pieces of grilled mackerel he hadn't finished before heading down to check on the nets. It was all he had. He picked up a piece, held it out, and then couldn't think of anything better to say than, "Do you eat fish?" She looked at him, then at the fish, then back at him, and despite everything, despite being soaking wet and disoriented, and having apparently survived a night at sea, she laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her, and it changed her whole face. She took the fish. "I'm Amara," she said between careful bites. "Amara Vale." "Caleb Moore." She nodded slowly like she was filing that away somewhere important. Then she stood, unsteady at first, one hand on the wall, and moved to the shed's small window. The storm had cleared completely. Outside, the beach stretched wide and pale in the morning light, and at the far end of the cove, visible above the tree line, the old lighthouse rose against a blue sky. Amara went still. She stood at that window for a long moment without speaking. When she finally turned back, the ease that the laughter had put into her face was completely gone. "My mother grew up here," she said. "In Sun Bay. Her family built that lighthouse." She paused, her hand moving to the shell pendant at her throat, fingers closing around it. "They were forced out 15 years ago. I never knew the full story. She died before she could tell me." She looked back at the lighthouse. "I came to find out what actually happened." Caleb didn't say anything. He watched her hand close around the pendant, the gesture of someone who reaches for something familiar when the ground shifts beneath them, and thought, without knowing why, of the shell on the shelf above his bunk at home. Word traveled fast in Sun Bay. By mid-morning, 3 people had already stopped Caleb at the dock to ask about the woman he'd pulled off the beach. By noon, the story had grown she was a reporter, some said, or a government inspector, or someone sent by a rival development company to sabotage Victor's resort project. Caleb didn't bother correcting any of it. He had his nets to deal with, and a boat that needed bailing after the storm. He was crouched at the stern working a hand pump when he heard footsteps on the dock behind him. Caleb. He knew the voice before he turned. Victor Harlan stood at the edge of the dock in a pale gray shirt, hands in his pockets, looking relaxed in the way that people look relaxed when they have decided in advance how a conversation is going to go. He smiled the same warm smile he had always had, the one that made you feel like you were being remembered fondly. "Heard you had a busy morning," Victor said. "Storm washed some things in." Caleb kept working the pump. "Happens." Victor stepped closer and crouched down to Caleb's level, dropping his voice. "The woman. Amara Vale." He said the name carefully, like he had been practicing its weight. "I know who she is, Caleb. She's not here because she got lost in a storm. She came here on purpose, and the people backing her have been trying to kill this project for 2 years." He paused. "This project that brings jobs, real jobs, for people like you." Caleb looked up at him. "She told me her mother's family built the lighthouse." Something moved across Victor's face, fast, controlled. "Her family sold everything they owned and left town. That's the whole story." He stood back up, easy and unhurried. "I'm telling you this because I know you, and I know you don't want trouble. You've got Eli, you've got the boat. Don't let a stranger make that complicated." He left without waiting for an answer. Caleb found Amara where he'd left her, still in the watchman's shed, sorting through the contents of the waterproof bag with the focused quiet of someone taking inventory after a disaster. She had dried out. She looked steadier. He told her about Victor's visit, word for word because he thought she deserved that. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said, "He told you my family sold everything and left." "He did. My grandmother donated that land." Her voice was even, but her jaw was tight. "The beach, the dock, the lighthouse, she put it all in a community trust. It was supposed to belong to the fishermen of Sun Bay permanently. No individual, no company, no investor was supposed to be able to touch it." She looked at the bag on the cot. "There was a fire 15 years ago. Our house burned down. Afterward, my family was accused of financial fraud. The trust accounts had been emptied, and somehow the paperwork pointed at my grandfather. They left because staying meant jail." She met Caleb's eyes. "Victor Harlan took over the land titles within 6 months of my family leaving Sun Bay." Caleb sat with that for a moment. "You have proof of any of this?" "I have pieces," she said. "That's why I came." He stood in the doorway of the shed and looked out at the dock, his dock, where he had sold fish for 11 years, where his boat was tied, where Eli sometimes sat on the edge and dangled his feet over the water. Then he looked back at Amara. Victor had told him not to make things complicated. "You can stay," Caleb said, "until we figure out what you actually have." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a commitment. But it was enough for now, and they both knew it. They didn't hide. That was the first thing Caleb decided. Hiding would confirm every story Victor was spreading, and Sun Bay was too small a place for secrets to stay useful for long. So instead of keeping Amara out of sight, he brought her into the ordinary rhythm of the village, the morning fish market, the dock, the old net storage shed near the pier, the stretch of beach where fishermen gathered in the late afternoon to talk about nothing in particular. It was, he told himself, the most practical strategy. It also happened to make the days feel different than they had in a long time. Amara was not built for fishing village life, and she didn't pretend otherwise. On the second morning, she stood at the market stall and stared at 2 fish for a full 30 seconds before admitting she couldn't tell a mackerel from a herring. Caleb pointed out the differences, the striped back, the shape of the tail, and she listened with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely trying and knew she was starting from zero. She was worse at net repair. He gave her a section of damaged mesh and showed her the knot twice. She tied it wrong both times, then a third time in a way that was technically a different kind of wrong, which he found harder to explain. Eli, who had come down to the dock after school and was watching from a crate nearby, leaned over to inspect her work and announced, 2 out of 10. But I can tell you were trying. Amara looked at him. That's very precise. I take grading seriously, Eli said, and went back to his own section of net. Caleb caught himself smiling before he could stop it. He turned toward the water so neither of them would notice. There was a moment 3 days in that he didn't plan for. They were sitting together on the floor of the net shed in the late afternoon, and Amara was talking about her mother, not about the land or the trust or the fire, but just about the woman herself. How she used to hum while she cooked, how she kept a photograph of Sunbay's beach in a frame above the kitchen sink, even though she never explained why. How she wore a shell pendant every single day and told Amara, "When you feel lost, hold on to it." She touched the pendant as she said it, fingers closing around it the same way they had in the shed on the first morning. Eli looked up from the net. "Does it open?" he asked. Amara blinked. "What?" "The shell," he nodded at it. "My mom's shell, the one Dad kept. It was the kind that could open. Some of them are made that way." He paused. "I was just wondering." Amara turned the pendant over in her fingers, studying the seam where the two halves met. "I've never tried," she said slowly. "I honestly don't know." Eli seemed to file that away. He went back to the net without another word. Victor's response came at the end of that same week. Caleb arrived at the dock one morning to find his usual mooring space occupied by a harbor master's notice his berthing rights had been suspended pending a review of his licensing documentation. The documentation that had been valid and unchallenged for 11 years. The same day word began moving through the market that Amara Vale was a representative of a competing development firm sent to derail the resort project and replace it with something worse. The story had no source anyone could name, but it spread through suggestion, through repetition, through the reluctance of people to seem uninformed. 2 of the fishermen Caleb had known since childhood stopped returning his greetings. A woman who had bought fish from him every week for 6 years walked past his empty stall without making eye contact. Caleb understood what was happening. Victor wasn't arguing against him. Victor was simply making the social cost of standing beside Amara high enough that most people would step away on their own. It was working. At night, after Eli was asleep, Caleb sat on the porch and listened to the water and thought about how much easier everything would be if he had just walked past that rock ridge without looking. He never quite managed to wish he had. The lighthouse had been decommissioned for 8 years. The path up to it was overgrown, the iron door at the base rusted half shut, and the interior smelled like standing water and decades of salt air. Caleb had passed it 1,000 times without going inside. Most people in Sunbay had. It was one of those structures that becomes invisible through familiarity, present in every view of the cove, registered by no one. Amara had been studying the photographs her mother left behind, cross-referencing them against her grandmother's letters, and something in the stonework at the base of the lighthouse kept appearing in the background of the oldest images. Not the lighthouse itself, something at its base, a seam in the foundation that didn't match the surrounding stone. It took them 20 minutes with a pry bar borrowed from the net shed to find it a wooden panel set flush into the interior foundation wall, sealed with tar that had dried to the consistency of old rubber. Behind it was a compartment roughly the size of a storage trunk, dry inside, despite everything protected by the thickness of the lighthouse walls. Inside, a rolled survey map of Sunbay dated 1987, a handwritten will bearing the notarized signature of Ruth Vale, and a cloth-bound record book with 3 years of entries. Caleb held the lantern while Amara read. The lighthouse was dark around them, the only sound the wind pushing through gaps in the upper structure. He watched her face as she turned pages, the concentration, the careful stillness she used when she was trying not to react too quickly to something. Then she stopped. She turned the record book toward him and pointed to a page near the middle. It was a list of names, dates, medical conditions, approved, support amounts from the Vale Community Fund. The fund her grandmother had established to provide healthcare assistance to fishing families who couldn't afford treatment on their own. Caleb's eyes moved down the column of names. He found Dana's name on the fourth line from the bottom. Dana Moore. Approved Stage 2 treatment support. Disbursement status pending. Pending. The word sat in his chest like something physical. He read it again. Then he set the lantern down carefully on the stone floor because his hand had started to do something he didn't want it to do, and he needed both hands still. Dana had been sick for 14 months before she died. They had spent those 14 months making decisions based on what they could afford, which treatments, which specialists, how long they could keep trying before the debt became something Eli would inherit. There had been a period, about 8 months in, when a new treatment option had been available, but the cost was beyond anything Caleb could reach. He had spent 3 weeks trying to find a way. He hadn't found one. The fund had approved Dana's case. The disbursement had never arrived. He stood in the dark base of the lighthouse for a long time without speaking. Amara didn't say anything either. She waited. That was something he had noticed about her. She understood the difference between silence that needed filling and silence that needed room. When he finally looked up, he said, "Victor took the fund." "Yes." "Dana was on the list." "I know, I saw." He looked back at the record book. The anger came up fast and hot, the kind that doesn't announce itself, it was just suddenly there, filling his throat. Victor had grown up on this beach. He had eaten at people's tables. He had stood at Dana's funeral and put his hand on Caleb's shoulder and said he was sorry for the loss. "I want to," Caleb started. "I know what you want to do," Amara said quietly. "I understand it, but hear me for a second." She waited until he looked at her. "The truth shouldn't be used to break you again. It should be used so that Eli doesn't grow up in a village built on a lie." She paused. "If you go after Victor out of anger, he wins. He's been waiting for someone to come at him angry. He knows how to handle that." The wind moved through the lighthouse above them. Caleb reached down and picked up the lantern. He looked at the record book, at the survey map, at the handwritten will with Ruth Vale's signature. He thought about a lawyer somewhere who had watched all of this happen and said nothing, the kind of person who tells himself that silence is the same as not being involved. He thought about all the things that had been allowed to happen because the people who knew stayed quiet. Then he picked everything up one by one and put it carefully back in the compartment. "We need somewhere safer than here," he said. It wasn't the answer to what he was feeling, but it was the next right thing to do. And right now, that was enough. Victor chose the beach for his town meeting, which was either confidence or calculation, probably both. He had a stage built on the wide stretch of sand in front of the dock, flanked by printed banners showing architectural renderings of the resort, clean lines, infinity pools, a private marina where the fishing pier currently stood. The images were beautiful, in the way that things look beautiful before they exist. He had arranged chairs in rows facing the stage, and by the time the meeting started on Saturday afternoon, most of Sun Bay had shown up, partly out of curiosity, partly because Victor had made sure everyone knew that refreshments would be provided. He spoke for 40 minutes. He talked about jobs, not abstract jobs, but specific ones. Construction work during the build phase, permanent positions in hospitality management roles for local residents. He talked about tax revenue and school funding and the new medical clinic the resort development agreement would require the company to fund. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. He stood on that stage like a man who had earned the right to stand there and, in the particular way that Sun Bay understood earning through origin, through memory, through the fact that his father had fixed engines at this same dock he had. Caleb and Amara stood at the edge of the crowd and listened. When Victor opened the floor, Caleb stepped forward. He kept his voice level. He said that the community trust documents they had found in the lighthouse showed the beach and dock had been donated to the village permanently, which meant no individual had the legal authority to sell them to a private company. He said the records should be reviewed before any agreement was signed. Victor smiled from the stage. "Caleb, I respect you. But those documents were part of a trust that was legally dissolved when the Vale family declared insolvency 15 years ago. We have the paperwork." He looked out at the crowd. "I know there are people here who want to hold on to the past. I understand that. But our children deserve more than nostalgia." Several people nodded. Several more looked at the ground. Amara spoke next. She was composed, precise, and said exactly what she needed to say about the trust, about her grandmother's will, about the fund records they had found. But she was speaking to people who didn't know her, who had been told for a week that she represented interests opposed to theirs, and composure reads differently when the audience has already decided how to hear you. Afterward, walking back toward the dock, neither of them spoke for a while. Then Amara said, "They looked at me like I was asking them to choose between their past and their children's future." "Victor's good at framing it that way," Caleb said. "I'm not from here. That matters to them." "It does." She stopped walking. "You could have stayed out of this. You should have, probably. I'm sorry Don't." He said it more sharply than he intended, then softened. "Don't apologize for that." They stood on the dock as the afternoon light went flat and gray. Then Caleb said quietly, "You could leave after this. Go back to the city." Amara looked at him. "My whole life I've had nowhere to go back to. That's why I came here." She turned toward the water. "So no, I can't just leave." They stood there for another moment, the tension between them something neither of them had named yet. Then Eli appeared at the end of the dock holding 2 sticks of grilled fish, both visibly overcooked smoke still rising from the tips. He walked up to them with the calm authority of someone delivering important materials and held one out to each of them. "Are you two done fighting?" he said, "because the fish needs someone to lie and say it's good." Caleb looked at the fish, then at Amara. Amara pressed her lips together, trying not to smile and failing. The laugh came out of both of them at the same time, the kind that releases something that had been building for too long. Eli watched them with the satisfied expression of someone whose plan had worked exactly as intended. 7 out of 10 for the fish, Amara said, finally taking a bite. "That's generous," Caleb said. "I know," she said. "I'm being kind." They stood on the dock together in the fading light, and for a moment the weight of everything, the meeting, the crowd, the banners, Victor's careful smile, lifted just enough to breathe. The bag was gone, 3 days before the annual beach festival. Amara discovered it at dawn, the watchman's shed door left slightly open, the cot where she'd kept the waterproof bag pushed to one side, the bag itself missing. The documents from the lighthouse were inside it. The survey map, Ruth Vale's handwritten will, the record book with Dana's name in it. All of it. She stood in the middle of the shed for a long moment before she went to find Caleb. He took it quietly, which was worse than if he'd been loud about it. He walked the perimeter of the shed, checked the ground outside for tracks, checked the lock. It hadn't been forced, which meant someone with access, someone who knew the shed, someone from Sun Bay. Then he sat on the cot and looked at his hands. By noon, Victor had already moved. A notarized document appeared at the harbor master's office, and at the entrance to the fish market, a bill of sale dated 15 years prior, bearing what appeared to be the signatures of Ruth Vale and her husband, transferring all trust properties to a private holding company. Beneath it, a statement from Victor's legal team: the Vale family had sold willingly. The trust had been dissolved by mutual agreement. All subsequent land titles were legitimate. The document was a forgery. Caleb was certain of it. Amara was certain of it. But certainty and proof were different things, and they no longer had the proof. That afternoon, the harbor master arrived at the dock with 2 men from Victor's site team and informed Caleb that his berthing privileges had been permanently revoked, effective immediately. His boat was towed from its mooring while he stood and watched. He was told he could retrieve it from a secondary lot 2 miles up the coast, a lot with no market access and no road connection to the village center. By evening, the story moving through Sun Bay was that Caleb and the Vale woman had fabricated documents to interfere with a legitimate business transaction. Eli came home from school with a cut on his knee from where he'd fallen running, he admitted quietly, because some of the older boys had told him his father was making everyone lose their jobs. Caleb cleaned the cut without speaking. Eli didn't say anything either for a while. Then, "Dad, if doing the right thing makes everyone hate you, should you still do it?" Caleb put the bandage down. He looked at his son, the boy's face open and genuinely uncertain, not performing the question but actually asking it, the way children ask things when they have run out of their own answers. He didn't know what to say. He sat there with the question and found nothing adequate on the other side of it. Later, Eli slipped out while Caleb was on the porch. By the time Caleb realized he was gone, it was nearly dark. He found him at the rock ridge, the same stretch of beach where Amara had washed ashore 2 weeks earlier. Eli was sitting at the waterline, knees pulled up, watching the tide come in. Caleb sat down beside him without speaking. The water moved in and pulled back. In and back, the lighthouse stood at the far end of the cove, dark now, no longer in service, no longer guiding anything. "I don't know how to answer what you ask me," Caleb said finally. "Not in a way that sounds right." Eli nodded slowly. "I know. But I don't think I was wrong to help her, even now." Eli didn't respond immediately. He picked up a small stone and turned it over in his fingers, then put it in his pocket instead of throwing it. "Okay," he said. It was a small word, but he meant it. They sat there until the last light left the sky. Behind them, Sun Bay was preparing for the beach festival, lanterns being strung between boats, tables dragged onto the sand, fire pits dug and lined with stone. Tomorrow, Victor Harlan would stand in the middle of all of it and sign a contract that would end the village as it had always been. Caleb had no documents, no witnesses willing to speak, no standing at the dock, no plan. He had an 8-year-old boy sitting beside him putting stones in his pocket instead of throwing them into the sea. It was the only thing that kept him from feeling like everything was already over. The beach festival had always been the best night of the year in Sun Bay. Tables stretched the length of the main beach, covered end to end with food brought from every household in the village. Fire pits burned at intervals along the sand. Colored lanterns were strung between the boat masts and along the pier, reflecting in broken lines across the water. Children ran between the tables in the dark. Old men carried instruments. The smell of grilled fish and wood smoke and sea air combined into something that had no name, but that every person who had grown up in Sun Bay would recognize anywhere in the world for the rest of their lives. This year, Victor had positioned a raised platform at the center of it all, wide enough for a table, a microphone, and the 4 representatives from the development company who had arrived that afternoon in 2 black SUVs and were now standing near the platform's edge, looking at their phones. The signing was scheduled for 9 o'clock. Victor had framed it as a celebration, make the moment feel festive, make opposition feel like grief-spoiling, make the village feel that the only people standing against their future were people who couldn't let go of the past. Amara stood at the far edge of the gathering near the old net racks and watched the platform. She had not slept. The circles under her eyes were visible even in the firelight, and she held her arms crossed over her chest in the posture of someone holding themselves together through deliberate effort. Caleb found her there just after 8. "I'm sorry," she said before he could speak. "For all of it. Your boat, Eli's." "Stop," he said, not unkindly. She looked at him. "We have nothing left, Caleb. I came here with one purpose and I have nothing to show for it. Whatever I thought I could do for this place from my mother's memory..." She stopped. "I made everything worse for you and your son." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Down the beach, someone had started playing a guitar near one of the fire pits, and the sound moved through the festival noise the way music does when no one's quite ready to stop being sad. "I talked to Eli last night," Caleb said, "at the Rocks." Amara waited. "He asked me if doing the right thing is worth it when it makes everyone turn against you." He paused. I didn't have an answer for him. I still don't have a clean one. He looked out at the crowd, at the faces he'd known his whole life, at the platform with Victor's table and microphone, at the lanterns swaying between the masts. "But I know that how I handle tonight is the answer I'm actually going to give him, whether I mean to or not." He left her there and walked into the crowd. He didn't approach anyone with an argument. He didn't challenge anyone's decision or invoke the trust documents or mention Victor's name. He simply moved through the festival the way he'd always moved through it, unhurried, quiet, and stopped to talk to people he knew. He reminded Marcus, who ran the bait shop, about the afternoon, 11 years ago, when the whole village had hauled Marcus's boat off a sandbar in a rainstorm, everyone soaked, and how they'd all eaten fish together on the beach afterward because there was nothing else to do. He reminded old Cora, who had sold him his first net, about the wedding her daughter had on this same stretch of sand, and about the photograph that had hung in the harbor master's office for years, the one showing 3 generations of Sun Bay families standing in the water together after a record catch. He didn't say, "Don't let Victor take this." He just asked, "If this beach is gone, what do we tell our kids this place was?" Some people looked away. Some listened. A few walked with him for a short distance before drifting back to their tables. He didn't know if it was enough. He didn't think it was. At the net racks, Amara watched him and felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, but something adjacent to it. The recognition that she had been thinking about this fight as hers alone, and that she had been wrong about that from the beginning. She reached up and touched the shell pendant at her throat. Then she felt it, what she had never noticed before. A seam. Hairline thin, running along the back edge of the shell where the 2 halves met. Not decorative. Functional. Her fingers stilled. Somewhere nearby, Eli materialized out of the dark with the quiet purposefulness he had when he'd already decided something. He looked at her hand on the pendant. "Does it open?" he asked. The same question he'd asked in the net shed weeks ago. Amara looked at him. Then she took the pendant off and held it under the nearest lantern. The shell opened with a sound like a soft click, the kind of sound that has been waiting a long time to be made. Inside was a micro SD card, no larger than a thumbnail, sealed in a thin layer of clear resin that had kept it dry and intact through everything, through 15 years, through the ocean, through the storm. Amara stared at it in the lantern light. Eli stood beside her very still, the way he went still when he understood that something was serious. "My mother put this here," Amara said. It wasn't a question. She borrowed a phone from a young woman at the nearest table, someone she didn't know, who handed it over without asking why, maybe because of the look on Amara's face. The card fit a slot on the phone's edge. Amara's hands were steady. She had learned somewhere in the last 2 weeks to keep her hands steady even when the rest of her wasn't. The card contained a single audio file. She pressed play and held the phone up so the speaker faced outward. The recording was old, the audio quality thin and compressed, but the voice was clear enough. A man's voice, formal reading from what sounded like a prepared statement. He identified himself as Lawrence Briggs, former legal counsel to Victor Harlan's holding company, and said that he was making this recording of his own volition, as a matter of personal conscience. The kind of conscience, his voice suggested, that had taken 15 years of silence to find its way out. He spoke for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. He described in the flat, precise language of someone who had spent a career in law and knew exactly which words carried weight, how Victor Harlan had orchestrated the destruction of the Vail family trust. The manufactured insolvency accusations, the falsified transfer documents, the deliberate redirection of the community fund's disbursements, healthcare support, emergency assistance, the money that was supposed to reach families like the Moores into an intermediary account that Victor's company controlled. He named dates. He named figures. He said that he had been present for several of the key decisions, and that his silence had been purchased with a partnership stake in the resort project. He said he was no longer able to justify that silence. The recording ended. Amara lowered the phone. Around her, the festival noise continued, music, laughter, the crackle of the fire pits. The platform at the center of the beach was lit up, Victor already moving toward the microphone, the development company representatives gathering behind him with their folders and their pens. Eli looked at Amara. "Go get my dad," he said. Caleb was near the water's edge when Amara reached him. She didn't explain everything, there wasn't time. She just held up the phone and pressed play for 10 seconds. That was enough. He looked at her. She nodded. They walked toward the platform together. Victor was mid-sentence when Caleb stepped up onto the edge of the stage, not aggressively, not rushing, just stepping up the way a man steps onto something that belongs to him. Victor stopped talking. The crowd turned. Caleb stood in the firelight and looked out at the faces of people he had known his entire life. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for anger. He spoke the way he always spoke, simply, directly, without performance. "The morning after the storm," he said, "I found a woman on the beach. She was unconscious near the rock ridge, holding a bag she wouldn't let go of even when she was out cold." He paused. "I didn't know who she was. I brought her in because it was the only thing to do, and then I didn't know what to say to her, so I gave her a piece of fish and asked her if she ate fish." A few people in the crowd laughed quietly, involuntarily. "That's how this started," Caleb said. "One stupid question and one piece of fish." He let that sit for a moment. Then he looked at Victor, the man who had grown up on this beach, who had eaten at these tables, who had stood at Dana's funeral and said he was sorry. He said it quietly, without heat. "Victor, you grew up on this sand just like the rest of us. You know what this place means. I don't know what happened to make you go so far from that. But these people deserve to hear the truth and decide for themselves." He handed the phone to Amara. She connected it to the speaker system on the platform, a simple cable already there for the microphone. She pressed play. Lawrence Briggs's voice came out across the beach over the music and the fire and the sound of the water, clear and unhurried and specific. The crowd went quiet within the first 30 seconds, the particular quiet of people who are hearing something they half suspected and half refused to believe. Victor didn't move. He stood on his own platform and listened to his former lawyer dismantle, piece by piece, the version of events he had spent 15 years constructing. His expression didn't collapse. It settled the way a face settles when it has run out of the energy required to hold a position. When the recording ended, nobody spoke for a moment. Then old Cora, who had sold Caleb his first net and who had been in Sun Bay longer than anyone standing on that beach, said from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, "I knew Ruth Vale. I knew what she built here." Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "I should have said so a long time ago." Two other voices followed hers, then a third. People who had been silent for 15 years, saying now in front of everyone what they had known and buried. Victor's legal team began gathering their folders. Caleb stepped down from the platform and walked back to where Eli was standing at the edge of the crowd. The boy looked up at him. "Was that enough?" Eli asked. Caleb put his hand on his son's shoulder. "Yeah," he said. "I think that was enough." Across the platform, Amara stood in the firelight with the phone still in her hand, and for the first time since she had washed up on this beach, she looked like someone who had arrived somewhere rather than someone still searching. The resort project was formally canceled 6 weeks later. State authorities opened an investigation into the land title transfers based on the Briggs recording and testimony from 3 Sun Bay residents who had finally agreed to speak on record. Victor Harlan's holding company lost its operating license in the county. Victor himself left Sun Bay quietly on a Tuesday morning. Nobody saw him go. Nobody went to say goodbye. The beach stayed. The dock stayed. The fish market stayed. The lighthouse, the one Ruth Vale's family had built, and the one that had hidden her will in its foundation for 15 years, was restored over the course of 2 months by a rotating crew of volunteers that included, on most Saturdays, Caleb and Eli. Eli's contribution was primarily supervisory, which he performed with great seriousness and a clipboard he had found somewhere and refused to explain. Amara used her inheritance, the portion of the Vale estate that had been legally recoverable once the fraudulent transfers were unwound, to establish a community center on the land adjacent to the dock. It wasn't a grand building. It was low and open, with a covered outdoor area facing the water, where children could take classes, fishermen could repair equipment out of the rain, and anyone who wanted to sit and watch the ocean could do so without being moved along. She designed it herself. She had, after all, spent her career designing spaces that connected people to landscapes, and she had never had a landscape that mattered to her the way this one did. The center opened on a Saturday in late spring. Most of Sun Bay came. On the evening after the opening, Caleb grilled fish on the beach. This had always been the measure of things in his life, whether the fish burned or not. Tonight, it did not burn. He turned each piece at the right moment, and by the time Amara came and sat beside him on the piece of driftwood he used as a bench, the fillets were golden and intact and smelled the way grilled fish is supposed to smell. She took a piece. She ate it. She was quiet for a moment in the considering way she had when she was being honest about something. "Better," she said. "Much better than the first time." "The first time was an emergency," Caleb said. "It was still pretty bad." "I was working under pressure," she smiled. "So this is what you're like without pressure." "This is what I'm like," he said. Eli appeared from somewhere behind them. He had a talent for appearing at moments that mattered, as though he operated on a different frequency than other people and picked up signals in advance. He looked at the fish. He looked at Amara. He looked at his father with the expression of a person conducting a formal assessment. 7 out of 10, he announced. "The fish." "You gave it 7 last time too," Amara said. "Last time was generous, this time it's accurate." He picked up a piece and ate it in 2 bites, then reconsidered. 7.5. "High praise," Caleb said. "It is," Eli looked at Amara. "If you stay and eat fish with us regularly, I'll probably give him a 9 by the end of summer. The pressure helps." Amara looked at Eli, then at Caleb. Caleb was looking at the water, but the corner of his mouth had moved in a way that he couldn't entirely control. "I'm staying," Amara said. "I was already staying." Eli nodded, satisfied, as though this had been the expected outcome of a process he had been managing for some time. He took another piece of fish and wandered back down the beach toward a group of kids who were trying to build something at the water's edge that kept collapsing. Caleb and Amara sat on the driftwood in the quiet that followed. Down the beach, the lanterns from the community center opening were still lit, swaying slightly in the evening wind. The lighthouse beam had been restored and was moving in its slow arc across the water, not because any ships needed guiding tonight, but because it was working again, and a working lighthouse is the kind of thing a village keeps running simply because it should. The tide came in, the fire burned down, the children laughed at whatever they were building that kept falling apart. Caleb thought about Dana not with the weight he usually carried, but with something quieter. He thought about the way she used to sit exactly like this, facing the water, and how she had told him once that the ocean was the best listener she'd ever found, because it never tried to fix anything. It just received. He thought, "I did right by you, by Eli, by this place." It wasn't everything, but it was enough. Beside him, Amara was watching the lighthouse beam complete its arc and start again. She had one hand resting on the driftwood between them, close, not touching, the way things are when they are still becoming what they are going to be. The evening settled around Sun Bay like it always had, slowly, fully, without asking permission from anyone. If this story meant something to you, Caleb's quiet stubbornness, Eli's wisdom in a small voice, Amara finding the place she'd been looking for her whole life, then you already know why stories like this matter. Subscribe to the channel so you're here for the next one. And if someone in your life needs to hear that doing the right thing is still worth it, even when it's hard, share this with them. We'll see you in the next story.